Okay. Ready?
Sure.
All right. So, okay. Hi, everyone. And we have some people participating over Zoom. So welcome to this ERC seminar by Rene Kizilcec. We talked about this over the. So Rene is an assistant professor at Cornell University in the Information Science Department. He actually has a degree in philosophy. So we'll hear about his philosophy, but his PhD is in communications from Stanford University. His research over the last decade or so has been concentrated on online learning. And we all know from the last couple of years, how online learning can be a very, very important tool or method of learning in this complex world that we have. And we have a bunch of new people coming, so welcome. Let's have you settle down a little bit. So I'll just elaborate a little bit before he begins his talk. Education is where something like equity is very important. Fairness, access, all these very socially important aspects that are difficult to observe. And we've seen over the last 2 years how some things work and some things do not. But rather than having these sort of guesses about what works and what doesn't, we'll need a scientific inquiry into online education, massively online education, and hybrid education. I think these are all very interesting spaces. And Rene has been, he's an expert in all of these interesting research questions. So I'm very pleased to welcome Rene. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Where should I stand? I'm not
Does
sure
that
where the
work?
camera is.
Yeah, that works perfect.
Yeah,
You can see yourself.
doesn't cut off my face or anything. Yeah, okay, great.
You're a little tall, but I think it works.
So let me try something that I practiced a little. 안녕하세요. 초대해 주셔서 감사합니다. And now I'll switch to English. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and finally see KAIST campus. Juho has been telling me a lot about it. And of course, the timeline here, he is not actually co-present, but I hope to come back one time when he's here as well. And I really enjoyed the dinner I had with students from his lab last night and the discussions we've had there. So today I'm going to talk about fairness transfer and somewhat about explainability of AI in education. Before I do, just a little overview of what I do. I lead a lab called the Future of Learning Lab in Ithaca, New York. Ithaca, New York is kind of the Daejeon of New York. So New York City is down here, Toronto's over there, and Ithaca is kind of halfway between the two. At the bottom of one of these Finger Lakes. So if you ever get a chance to go out there, let me know. I'd be happy to meet up. This is our computer science department. Looks very futuristic, and we can meet up there for a coffee and chat. The lab does a few different things. It's pretty broad in terms of the research that we do. I could classify it into these 3 groups, and I want to give you a little example of what each one of these looks like before jumping into the topic of this talk. So first, there's educational data science with big learner data. You could also call that learning analytics or educational data mining, sort of terms these days to describe this work. And what that looks like, for example, is something like this. So this is a study that we presented just a few weeks ago in Learning at Scale. And here we took learning management system data from Canvas at an institution, and we looked at how students' behavior varies across students and across assignments that they perform at the university in order to measure procrastination behavior. There's a big literature on procrastination in psychology and other areas. And here we use the time of the submission of thousands and thousands of assignments that students have in order to see do they tend to submit late or do they tend to submit early? Right? And it's a very scalable definition that doesn't have to sort of account for all the extensions that instructors make around and all the policies in each course. Just are you late or are you early, right? And so here you see for 3 example students, the student in blue is pretty early, they're very low on this score, and the student in green tends to submit late. Student 2 in the middle started off late and then became early and then became late again, right? And so this is in one course, 30 assignments. And then we take those, we sum them up, and we have a score for that student for that course. And so in this data set, we had 152,000 of those across a few years at that institution. And then we can look at things such as how does procrastination relate to the grades that they get in the course? Do students who procrastinate more tend to get lower grades? And the answer is yes. That is a result that's well known in the literature and personal experience. And so even, the counterexample I sometimes get is, well, but what if, you're just a perfectionist and you just want to wait until the last minute to make sure it's just right before you submit it? It doesn't seem to help based on this. Not sure what that means about patterns of submitting papers for conferences. But the other thing that hasn't been studied much in the literature is how does procrastination vary across different groups of students? And might there be structural factors that influence whether students tend to submit earlier or later? Right? And first generation college students are a good example of that. They tend to struggle more with the experience in college because they don't have the social environment, the experience from their parents to know what to expect and how to navigate. And so they might face more challenges. Students who are low income students might also face more challenges because they're working jobs on the side in order to be able to pay for rent. And so there's a bunch of these factors that can contribute to that. And we do see in that paper a lot of variation in procrastination. And here you can see this across these intersectional groups between continuing generation college students whose parents did go to college, first generation college students who didn't, and then whether they are non-URM, so white or Asian in the US, or URM, which would include Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, other smaller groups. And so you see these gaps.
If you want to take off your mask.
I can?
Yeah.
Is that permitted? Thank you so much. Well, I'm used to lecturing with this, although I think that those times are over now. Cornell is going to mask it soon. Much easier. So that's one example of this kind of work. And if you want to ask questions about that kind of thing, which is unrelated to the rest of the talk, please feel free to as well. I'll give you an example of another one. And feel free to raise your hand if you have questions in person or in Zoom. This is an example of scalable interventions to improve learner outcomes. We did a lot of work early on MOOCs, massive open online courses, looked at why is it that students do not persist very long, and then used that research to inform interventions to be able to help students stay in the course for longer and achieve their learning goals. And so that quickly evolved, and we started testing interventions that help students with self-regulation, help students with social belonging. And they looked very promising at first across some large courses that we did, but then we wanted to scale this, and we put them into, this is 247 courses. We scaled it across all MOOCs basically that were going out from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford for a 3-year period. And so we were able to look across a lot of environments and see if these interventions work well, even once you scale them up. And the answer is kind of no, they don't work quite as well as they do in specifically hand-selected courses where you sort of know everything and you selected them because you knew that something was wrong there. And once you scale it up across many environments, the effects get diluted quite a bit. And so we did some work on showing the shorter term effects where you do see some differences, but they're really small. As you can see, this sort of behavior in the first 3 weeks and how much students are active in the course. And the differences are minor. They're significant, but they're not what you would hope for across a few different interventions. But one thing that I want to point out is we used offline policy learning. This was with Emma Brunskill and one of her students, and we tried, give us the best you can do of offline policy evaluation. Can we figure out which students should get which intervention based on their characteristics to help them in the course? Unfortunately, we couldn't do better than random. Didn't matter, if we gave you a random intervention out of these, it was just as good as trying to give you the optimal one. But I want to say that the data is available for researchers. It's pretty big. And so if that's something that you're working on or interested in, I encourage you to take a look, and maybe you can do better and come up with something that we didn't. So that's an example of this. One extension of that is something I just want to give a shout out about, which is BERI. It's a platform that allows you to do your own intervention research in higher education courses. So we realized that we are very privileged in having access to 247 MOOCs that went out to 250,000 people. And most people don't have access to that. So if you are interested in doing intervention research like this, randomized experiments with different tasks or sort of writing activities or whatever it is, we created this partnership with an adaptive learning platform that has real for-credit courses in higher education and allows us to take researcher suggested interventions and build them in and provide you back with the data. And so we have a few sort of successful use cases of closing that loop and doing replications now of some of the findings that have worked out well. So if you're interested, take a look and let me know if there's something you want to know about how to do it or whether it's a fit.
Is that
Yeah.
Mostly US right? Or
So far it has been, but they are based in Ireland. So the platform is called Realize It. It's an adaptive LMS. And they do have customers in other countries as well. I can't tell you which ones they are, but there are some others, yeah. One other example of work that we're doing is around data-driven systems to facilitate reflection, exploration, discovery for students in education. So one example here is the Pathways project, which we just launched at Cornell. What we use is data on students' enrollments over time during the degree program. And we try to provide that information back to students in a way that facilitates choices, decision-making that they have to do during college. A lot of students have to make difficult choices, what courses they take, which direction they want to go into, how they match their interests to a degree, the other way around. And there's not much information available about what other students have done, right? You can go ask other students, but that's your social network and that might be biased in certain ways. You don't really see an overview of what's going on. And so more and more we're seeing these data sets being opened up for researchers in order to really help the universities provide better experiences to students, provide information to administrators, to instructors. And so this is one of the examples of sort of an early, the design has changed now, but here you see for one specific student based on your interest, it shows you what this student took who shares your interest, right? They took these classes in their first semester, they took a semester off, which, you know, people rarely talk about that, right? So these abnormal things, right? You sort of think, oh, you can't take a semester off, you have to stay in school. You might see that a student did take a semester off, and that's fine. They still graduated. And so you sort of see things that might conflict with what you think the norms are. And that's exactly what we want to achieve here. We want students to see what actually is out there and sort of not see the filtered version of what their friends are telling them. So we're looking at other systems that might use data like this, might use LMS data, and try and make that useful in ways that is not necessarily a recommender system that tells you sort of what we think you should do, but tries to do some data storytelling, tries to be descriptive about what is going on for you to develop understanding of the norms. Yeah, please.
So I'm curious, how did you collect data, and wasn't there any issues on privacy?
Yeah, so we didn't collect it because the university has to collect it. Right, so the registrar's office is federally mandated to collect all this information, keep it, and it's all digital now. So how did we get access to it? We asked to get access to it, and you know, we gave a good reason. And we're working very. The project is sponsored by the provost's office at the university, and so they're excited about it because they see the value in it. The registrar of the university sees the value in it. And so I think there's a lot of support from stakeholders at institutions for this kind of work for that reason. Are there privacy concerns? Not as many as you might think, in the sense that we can easily strip all the names, we can hash IDs, and you know, you could still, they are kind of unique, pathways are, but the work you have to go through in order to figure out what student that is very hard. And it's not clear what you get out of that. So, when you add data into the mix, you might get a bit more sensitive, right? So one of the things we actually do in this, and that's a good model, I think, for other places, is all the clickstream data that we collect from students interacting with these systems. We hash the ID, the students have to log in using their college ID. And then we hash that using the same way that we ask the registrar to provide us hashed information. So without knowing who they are, we can match them up. And so we can know, oh, this is a art history student who's performing that search, who tends to be, happens to be a Black female and first generation college student. So we can also understand something about the context of these students without knowing what the name of the student are. So that's a process that has worked very, very well.
So does it
Yeah.
do you have grade information or no?
Technically, I do for other projects, but for this, that engineering team that worked on building the system does not have access to that.
But you can have access to it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That would be, I mean, I think it would be very helpful to try to predict the grades based on the pathway.
Yeah, it's a point of debate whether what do grades mean in this context, right? So this kind of application assumes a little bit that the students are in an environment where they're relatively safe to graduate on time, and they're going to be fine on the job market, right? If you're in an environment where the students, a large percentage of students drop out, don't finish their degree on time, and end up with a lot of debt, which is the reality at most institutions in the United States, majority of institutions in the United States, then this might not be the right application, really, right? Then an application that is more of a recommender system, because here is the safest choice in order to fulfill your requirements and graduate in time and get out and get a good job, might be more useful. So it's a little bit of a luxury in a sense to be able to be in a position where you can explore freely and figure out your interests. And there, it's unclear how much the grades matter and how much we want to. Students are already very focused on the grades when we ask them what goes into their decision making about which courses to choose. Grades are very high up on the list. And I think it's a good idea to be open to risk taking in college, because it is a relatively safe environment to go, take that art history lesson. Might be hard and challenge you in new ways. And then it's okay that you only get an A- on an A+ once. There are some studies that have looked at based on historical trends, are you prepared for this next class based on your grades in the other classes? And there's a good amount of signal there, but I worry that students might read too much into that, perhaps. There's a lot of selection effects too.
Is this data publicly available?
This data?
Yeah.
No. But there are efforts to make such data available. One that is remarkable is in a team at the University of Mexico, Monterrey, that's the Technical University of Mexico, Monterrey. They've been running competitions. They're releasing some data like this, actually more than this, way more than this. And they are encouraging researchers around the world to take the data and build a better student dropout prediction model than their current model, because they just want to have a better model. And they realize that there's lots of people out there who find this interesting. And so they run it as a competition. They've had a few different competitions, and they actually release that kind of data hashed, but with a lot of information about students' incoming grades, high school, and other characteristics. And I think I'm predicting that we'll see more and more of that. In fact, there are some NSF-funded, IES-funded projects to try and find ways of safely opening up these data sets more for the research community. All right, so those are the three projects, so types of work that we do, and they're quite broad, and there's a lot of stuff under these umbrellas. I teach two classes. One is especially relevant here. It's a class on learning analytics. It's students from all over the university now. It's 200 students about. And one of the things I love about the class is it opens students' mind up to educational data and how they're constantly producing it. And what you can do with it, what you can't do with it. And so I give them their own data in the class. I use the Open edX platform for that course. And then I give them a download for different assignments throughout the class of their records. And then they do tasks like predict who is going to not submit the homework on time for the next homework, right? Or they take a survey on self-regulated learning strategies, and then they try and feature engineer based on the clickstream data, features that will predict self-regulated learning strategies, right? And they find things like, oh, help seeking, relatively easy to find some features because you look at the forum interactions. But then things like goal setting, there's not much you can do because there's no goal setting activity in the course, right? And so they start thinking about how they need to design in ways that collects the data that you need in order to connect it to sort of theoretical constructs like goal setting that are important. If you're interested in that kind of course or teaching that kind of course, I got a chapter coming out that talks about how it's created, how it's built up, and how we're using data and getting students to think about ethics in the course as well. So I'm happy to share that on the preprint. All right. And as Alice mentioned already, my background, based on this, you might be confused. You know, who is this person? It is a lot of different things, but at the end, with my PhD in communication, I spent a lot of time with computer scientists and people in the ed school, and that was really nurturing at Stanford. And so that's where sort of all of these things have come together in these kinds of research projects. So with that, I'll talk about fairness, transfer, and explainability. And I'll start off with where is this AI in education that I'm talking about, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. And so the specific area I'm thinking of are systems like intelligent tutoring systems that are used to help students master content, right? Assessments, as an example, the cognitive tutor. Automated open-ended question answering is another popular kind of AI in education. Chatbots, very hot topic right now. A lot of interest, a lot of grants being put out, competitions for chatbots. Advising systems for student and staff. Right? There's a clear need for more scalable advising systems. We know that a lot of the students who need advice don't go and get it. Right? Very similar to the students who like click the help button in cognitive tutoring systems, right? The ones that really should be clicking that button for ask for a hint, they often don't do it or don't do it at the right time. One, I think, exciting work is at UC Berkeley. Zach Pardus's work on Ask OSCE is really interesting, where he does take the recommender system approach. Right? He does tell you, here's the course that based on your interests will fulfill your requirements, and it's something that you should go for. And then finally, and this will be mostly the focus of the talk as the context, dropout and student success systems. And they are absolutely ubiquitous in the US at the very least. And I'm actually curious what the status of that is in Korea, if they're as ubiquitous here as they're in the US now. Like in the US, most schools, like middle school, primary schools too, high schools have adopted systems that make predictions for students' grades, how well they will achieve. Most colleges and universities have adopted systems that will predict who's going to drop out and be able to sort of give that information to advisors. So it's a big market. Here's some of the three maybe most popular ones that are out there: the PACE system, the course signals that was deployed at Purdue, one of the earliest ones, and then the GPS system as well. And so it's a really, yeah.
I know for universities, it is probably okay, but for primary schools, are there regulations or some debate about whether it's ethical?
Well, it's not well known that it is being used. And if it were, maybe there would be.
So I mean, I know I was talking to some education policy people in Seoul, and they are thinking about this, but they're mostly not for this idea.
Yeah.
They think that it'll disadvantage minority.
Yeah, personally, I think it's a little early for it. It is too early in primary school to be doing this. In the end, the question is really, what do you do with it? You can always build these models, but what are people going to do with the information that they get out of them? And there's certainly negative things that they could be doing. there might be positive things, right? And I think that is the space that we still don't understand well enough. Like, we know how to build these models, and we can now make them fairer than they were before because we're paying more attention to that. But even if you have the perfect model, right, then there's a question of what do the stakeholders do with that information? Because most of the times, you need the stakeholder to make a decision, to act, and that is the part that is sort of the least studied, and how badly that can go, how it sometimes can go well, and under what circumstances that can go well.
I mean, so another thing that triggered the elementary school teachers is that in Korea currently, the public education, the public schools they don't test kids because testing it was just over, like the education fervor here is a little too much, right? So these days, elementary school kids are not tested. There's no like official test. So, but in order to do something like this, you do need some quantitative control. So that's one of the reasons teachers are against.
Right. Yeah. The question on testing, especially early on, is one that in the US, oftentimes you do get grades for kids even in primary school, whereas in many other European countries, my experience, you do not. You should get a written assessment, right? And I do also think that the written assessment makes more sense at that age, putting grades on students. But then even in some of the countries where it's written, because they still want to be able to track student progress, there are some standardized tests, but they're never reported to anybody. And so students have to sit them, but it's not like the parents see the scorecard and see where their student ranks. So I think is sort of a good middle ground, because that way you still have accountability to some extent, but you don't make it a big deal. But the fact of the matter is that in the US it's kind of too late. Like these are, I mean, unless somebody puts their foot down and says we're going to get rid of these, they are there. So the question is, what do we do about that, and where might that cause a real problem or not? And, it seems like a lot of countries are eager to adopt them, or some people are eager to adopt them. So I wonder how long people are going to resist that kind of temptation. So if we think about AI, so I'm going to take these one in turn, fairness, transfer, explainability. So in terms of the fairness piece, there really is a big history in education. So AI fairness is a little bit newer in the AI space, but education fairness has been a major concern right from the beginning. Right, work on school segregation, who gets to go to what schools, which in a different way is still very relevant, even in a place like Korea, right, where you live and the house price you are able to pay determines where you can go to school. Achievement gaps between groups of students, inequities, a differential item functioning, and more of the psychometric space, are all really questions of fairness that have been studied for many decades in that space. When we talk about it in the context of AI, really it's asking about bias and discrimination of algorithmic systems. That's really what fairness is, the opposite of bias and discrimination in those systems. And so there's been a lot of work over the last few years around how to quantify that bias. Just, and maybe it's all a little bit delayed from the CS literature, where now we're sort of figuring out, well, how do you quantify this in education? What are good measures of bias? And a few different people have sort of looked at this in a few different contexts, come up with different measures of fairness in those that make sense in those contexts. But generally speaking, there isn't one right measure. It really depends on what the goal is and what kind of system you're looking at, or what measure is appropriate in that context. If you're interested in this space, there's slight self-promotion here, but there's two reviews that are really recent that I think complement each other wonderfully. We didn't know about this when Ryan was writing. So we have these two reviews that look at slightly different aspects of the space, but if you read both of them, you kind of have a good understanding of what's going on, what's out there. But also excitingly, partly based on this review, the UPenn lab just put out this wiki that tries to catalog various studies that have looked at bias in education and they sort of look at it by the group that is impacted, which also interestingly sort of shows, I like that they did that, put in which ones we have no evidence about yet, right? So you see, so in red, the ones that don't have content on that page in the wiki. And then also by the application of the algorithmic system. So it's a great resource to see what's out there, what hasn't been done, maybe see sort of a place where you can contribute in that literature. So the case study that I want to share with you on the fairness piece is one that that really was sparked by this blog post by Simon Buckingham-Shaw. He released a blog post in 2020. This was certainly motivated by racial unrest that started in the US with the killing of George Floyd. And he asked the question, should predictive models of student success be colorblind? Meaning, should they consider race, ethnicity as a feature in the model? And this is an important question that the US Supreme Court is looking at this in the context of admissions and whether college admissions should have access to this information as they go through. Many of you probably heard about the Harvard case around that question. And so here we're looking at this in the context of student predictive models. And you can make two arguments really, right? On the one hand, you can say color aware models, ones that have the feature in there, they can capture systemic inequities, right? And account for those when predicting for future students, right? They don't pretend like they're not there. The colorblind models, on the other hand, they might mitigate those biases instead of perpetuating them, right? So you can think of it from both perspectives. An influential paper by John Kleinberg and colleagues found a few years earlier that including race in an admissions prediction task actually improved demographic parity and performance. And so that sort of suggested that it's a good idea to let the model know where there are differences so that it can sort of incorporate that into the decision-making process, right? So that would kind of speak for the color aware aspect of it, but making the argument that actually is people would make for the color blind sort of a camp. So we were really interested in extending this and providing some more empirical evidence for which one is better for the actual task, because the blog post didn't really have a study behind it. So we looked at this for a 4-year public Hispanic serving institution in the United States that has an online component where students are getting degrees fully online, bachelor's degrees fully online, and a large residential component where they're on campus getting degrees. And so the outcome we're focusing on here is first your dropout prediction. We have the information from your first semester in college, and we want to predict, are you coming back the next year and enrolling, taking courses? We're looking at accuracy, recall, the true negative rate of the model. And the attributes that we consider sensitive beyond race, ethnicity in this study are male, first generation college student, URM, and high financial need. Okay, so we look at 4 big ones. And then the other factors in this model are a bunch of features that we can engineer based on your first semester, based on your SAT scores coming in, and some other characteristics coming in. Okay? And as you can see, the dropout rates for the different groups, they vary quite a bit across the different groups. So we have the following situation. We have one model that's the aware model. It has those 4 features in there. And then we have a model that we call the blind model that excludes those, but has the other features the same. We compare 2 algorithms, logistic regression and gradient boosted trees. We do out of sample evaluation where we predict, like you would in this case, the last cohort, right? We don't split evenly because that's not what makes sense in this case, but you have the data from the past and you try and do the next year. And we use a decision threshold that makes sense for the dropout rate from before. So we learned where we should do the cutoff, instead of just doing it at 50%. And so here's what we find if you just plot the predictions for non-dropout and dropout between the aware and the blind model. Okay. And so you don't see much variation visually. I just want to give you a sense of what these predictions look like, right? The model isn't perfect. It sort of mispredicts quite a few students. But but here, sort of, if we summarize it in a table, you see on the aware side, the accuracy 75.8%, the blind side 75.6. The difference is just 0.2, right? And that difference is really what we're interested in here in the study. And as you can see, these differences are very small, and none of them are significant. Is this a great model? It's not the best model, but it's an okay model. If we look at the literature on how well these models do, this is in the ballpark of what a reasonable model does. You can certainly do better. But I don't think that would change the conclusion that there is not much information in these. Now, if we look at the fairness, right, it's interesting to look at, well, how does dropout really vary across different groups? And so you do see that there's some variation by sex, by URM, not so much by first gen, at least online, and then a bit more around high need. Maybe not as much as one would expect, which is good. But so the question is, does the model do a lot better for some groups than it does for other groups? And so here's how we quantify that. This is, for example, for accuracy. If the model predicts more accurately for URMs than it does for non-URMs, we call that the group difference. So that's what we plot here. The red is the aware model that has those features. Blind is unaware. And really, you're looking at the difference between them. So you can see those bars are all the same. You can see that overall, the model does worse for URM students, first gen, and high need students, but it does worse equally. Doesn't matter if you include those features. And so we can extend that to the other outcomes. And as you can see, the story is really the same. It has better recall for some students than others, but it doesn't really vary. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, what do you mean by aware and blind? Because I mean, I imagine that the aware as some kind of label referring to the race of the students which you are studying, but the blind model is anyhow able to infer the race of the students just maybe because of where they live or other factors like that?
Yeah, so exactly. So you might have some signal and the other characteristics that are in there that predict. And so we did look into that. We did try and predict. We looked at how much predictive power is in those labels themselves, just the 4 attributes. There's almost nothing in there. It's very, very little, right? And that's not surprising, right? We know that we study achievement gaps a lot, and because they're important in socially and for equity, but that doesn't mean that the features are actually highly predictive of any of the outcomes, right? The R-squared values are very low, right? That doesn't make them less important. So we see that consistently, that those don't predict. But we also didn't see much evidence, and we present the analysis in the paper, that the other features can predict whether or not you're male or female, or whether or not you're above and beyond what the chance would be anyway, given the environment that you're in. So we don't see much evidence that the data is all that encoded in it. We did try some work where we tried to really take out the variance associated with these labels, and the results were the same. Like, it didn't really it just made things more complicated, but it didn't really change things. So that's what I would have expected, that it's all encoded in these early data points, but we didn't see much of that evidence. We just see that they don't seem to matter all that much in this task. And maybe that's because the differences between the groups is not that large, right? And that's mostly related to other factors.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, good question. This is just the same for online, which, as you can see, is the same. Right? None of these ever differ. So this is what we saw in this study, comparing the two. So we find no evidence really that there's a difference, including these highly debated attributes, right? I mean, people have very strong opinions on whether they should be in there or shouldn't be in there. At the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference from what we see in this context, right? And so online and an in-person school. We still argue for the aware model because it does recognize that there are these differences, and they are important in the sense that we have been struggling to reduce these differences. And so in line with, John Kleinberg and colleagues make the argument and we sort of draw on a little bit of critical race theory and some other theories that have said that colorblind ideology has been classified as somewhat racist in the sense that it tries to sort of pretend like these differences don't matter and are not meaningful. And so in that sense, we don't see any negative effect of including these features. So it seems more wholesome to include them. Maybe that's sort of my philosophy contribution to the talk that Alice hinted at. Having said that, in another context that I'm not going to talk about today, namely college admissions, sort of helping the admissions officers with the process of admitting students, undergraduates to the college, we find that aware models are quite effective at replicating desired biases. So if you've been admitting more students of a certain group in order to achieve parity, then these models are very good at replicating that effort done by humans manually in the past with the model later on, right? If you say have an engineering school and you have applicants only make up 30% are women, 70 are men, and you're admitting a 50-50 class at the end of the day, it will increase the likelihood of women in the model that you get, as you would expect, right? And so there, the aware model does its job in the sense that you want it to continue to carry forward those values. So it depends on the context. Any questions about the fairness piece before I switch to transfer? Yeah.
That you're using a lot of the graph phrase
Yes.
data. Do you ever find any latent attributes?
Sorry, anyone?
Like latent hidden attributes in the data that you never predicted, but you have some kind of effect on the data?
What's an example of you thinking of something specific?
Very so like something that you discovered along data, I think that wasn't super evident in the labels, but that you found some relationship later on.
And the thing is not sex or URM or something else, you mean? I mean, one of the things that you always see is that prior behavior predicts future behavior a lot better than anything else, really, right? And so that's the one thing that you can reliably use in general. What else do we see? In the context of MOOCs, at least the survey was a really good indicator for commitment. The students who took this, it sounds sort of trivial, but the students who cared to take the survey were way more committed to the course, were much more likely to persist, more so than anything that the students who took the survey said on the survey, right? So taking the survey was a much better signal of completing the course than anything that the people who did take the survey said on the survey, right? Even though plenty of those still did not finish the course, right? Which I think once again speaks of the power of behaviors when you're trying to predict the behavioral outcome. That's an example that comes to mind. So switching over to transfer, which I think is a really important area where we take a model that's built in one place, could be a classroom, could be a school, a district, and we're deploying it in another one. Right? And you might, why might you do that? Well, first of all, because you have limited resources locally where you want to deploy the model, right? You don't have the data there, you don't have the infrastructure to build the models, so you don't have staff who can help you export the data. And that is a common case in many sort of lower income environments or low resource environments, that you still would like to have the benefits of a model, but who don't have the resources in order to build it. It's also as relevant for most commercial applications, right? Where you have to scale the model you have, right? You can't go into every place and build a new model that just isn't feasible mostly, right? And so there you have that same issue where you need to transfer to many different environments. And so the question that really comes up is, well, when do these models transfer successfully in educational environments, and can large-scale cross-institutional models do well in overcoming some of the challenges and being more generalizable across them, right? If we collaborate across a few different universities, say, can we build a model that works at even more universities compared to just one university's model that's transferred to? And so I'll address each of these questions in some examples. The first is a study that I won't go into too much detail of, but I'm really excited about it. And we never got to sort of really finish it because the student who was working on it graduated. And then it's very hard to continue. But I think it's a really cool data set to be doing this with. So this is looking at PISA data. Is everybody familiar with PISA? It's a large scale survey. It's a long-standing effort by I want to say OECD. I'm not sure if that's true, to collect representative samples across a number of countries around the world using a standardized measure of math, science, and reading, plus surveys of a lot of other stakeholders, students, teachers, parents, information about the school. So it's a very rich data set about students all in the same time in their academic career, middle school, often they vary the age group, I think. And they look at how well the students do, and you often see these comparisons of countries. Who ranks first on PISA, and Finland or Scandinavia always seems to do the best on them. And so in this sample, we included 65 countries. Those were subsetted because they had most of those survey data complete. Right? Sometimes one country doesn't do the parental one, or so we sort of looked at where can we get the most data for the most countries. So we looked at them. We look at students' math and science achievement. We predict, are you in the top 10% within that country? But you can use different prediction targets, the results hold. We've got 200 variables that we use to create a bunch of features. Those are the ones that are all commonly available ones. We use a random forest model, although other models perform similarly on this. And we looked at a few different outcomes. I'll show you balanced accuracy, but it's probably really holds quite well across any of these choices. And so what we're interested in is what happens if you take a model built in one country, like the US, that has the resources and might create a company that then goes out and tries to help other countries with the education system, for better or worse, and deploy it in other countries. So here you see the US model trained in the US and then tested around the world. And you see the accuracy in each of these countries. Larger bubbles are sort of larger samples, although they are all nationally representative, doesn't really matter. And then down here on the x-axis, you see the Human Development Index, which is highly correlated with GDP per capita, right? So basically how rich of a country is it, how developed of a country is this. It also includes some education and health factors. But as you can see, if you train in a rich country, test in rich countries, does similarly. The less developed the country, the worse the accuracy in that country, until it's basically chance. And so that's what we see when we use the US model. And you could explain that by saying, well, the data quality might be worse, maybe, although for PISA, that's hard to argue. They do a lot of work to try and make sure that the data is good. Because you say maybe it's predictability. Maybe it's just harder to know what students are going to, maybe there's a power outage, those are much more frequent in countries that are less developed. There's a lot of things that might be less predictable. But we have the data for all of these countries, right? Because PISA went there and did the survey. So we can actually see what would have happened if we had local data. And there's just no difference. You can just predict just as well. Sure, there's some variation, but the correlation is zero between development and your accuracy in the country, right? And so local data really matters, being able to go to local place, collect data there. And so one of the things that we wondered about then is, well, why is it that the US model deteriorates so much? Can we pinpoint, which I guess that talks to the explainability aspect of things. And so one thing that we can do is train a Ridge regression or some other regression model where you can inspect the coefficients. And you can look at how does the coefficient, the influence of that feature, vary across different countries. And so we see that the number of books at home, popular example in the US and sort of many other developed countries for where students do well, matters a lot, has a very high positive coefficient in developed countries. but it matters much less and less as you have a less developed country where the number of books at home isn't really a thing that matters as much. Other things that matter more. So we think. And so here's an example of a few others that have this positive slope, right, where things about personal aspirations of the students matters a lot more in more developed countries. Enjoyment of science that students report matters more. And then other things that matter more in countries with lower HDI, such as fearing the test, or mom holding a lower level service job, or dad holding a lower level service job, right? So it's more about sort of family value. So what's the home environment like? Is the home environment able to support the education, going to school, studying, fearing the test is an interesting one. We didn't quite know what to, it might be something about the school environment, whether it's sort of an inclusive environment that's supportive. Could be something to do with that. But we have a few examples of these. And so there's a lot more that can be done in order to dig into these differences and try some other ways of overcoming these this loss in bias. And because you know, in reality, you can't always get local data. And so what then do you do in order to overcome that? So that's example number one. Any questions on this? Give you example number two.
Are these?
Yeah.
It seems like you might want to take a combination.
To cluster them and
Yeah, I mean, so because in the end, what you want is transferability of US or other large country data to be able to predict the local scores. If you combine some of these, possible.
Combine the countries or combine the
Combine like these, you know, fear of tests or I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe, so maybe I'm not understanding like what the Y value, what you're trying to show with these.
so in a model that's trained in this country and predicts this, you know, all of these are trained in that country predicting the same outcome. The coefficient for this variable is almost 0. And in the same model, but trained on the data for the US, has a coefficient value of this. So in the US, personal aspiration has a stronger influence in the model on science achievement, whereas in this country, it doesn't matter. Conditional, of course, on all the other features that are in the model. Multiple.
Okay. So what I'm maybe wondering is if you combine the number of books, the enjoyment of science, personal aspiration, or these factors, can you do a little bit better in predicting whether somebody's going to do well in math and science, like you can with the US data? Is it going to be transferable?
When you say combine, you mean average them or?
I don't know. I don't know how you would combine it.
So one of the things we tried, I think that gets at your question, is we tried to come up with clusters of these various features where the countries share characteristics across many of these features. You know, so the places where these things matter. And then maybe within those clusters, there might be enough countries in there that you could pick a few and collect data there, build models based on that, and then that will transfer well enough to other countries in that cluster. Is that the kind of?
Yeah, I guess something like that could work. And you're saying those clusters are built on multiple features.
Yeah. So those look at sort of the different features, and maybe we can, you know, find the ones where these are all important in those ways. And yeah, exactly. We tried that. It was okay. It worked fine. There were some clusters, but they weren't separating very nicely. And was a bit too messy. So we, yeah. But I think the idea is a good one because that's sort of the practical next step, right? So if we can't always collect for 100 countries, then tell me 10 that will give me good coverage, right? Yeah.
One question about the readers itself is that, like, how much is the individual difference between the countries? For example, like a country from, say, East Asia versus the US, like what's the difference between personal aspiration or enjoyment of science? Like how much the divergence?
There's quite a bit. There's quite a bit of variation in these features. Some more than others, of course, but yeah, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there's pretty high variance on many of these. And of course, it varies across students in the country, right? So you've got sort of variation on the means, but also standard deviations and skew on some of them that are not so normally distributed. Yeah. Even within sort of the higher HDI countries, you can have a lot of variation across these.
And to make these graphs, like you first train the data on the US and then try to predict the.
No, I think I misspoke when I introduced it. It's trained on within each country, right? And then tested in the testing doesn't matter really here, right? It's just trained within the country, and then we look at the coefficient that is learned for the model in its own country, right? And then does it matter much the feature or not in your country? Yeah. Any other questions? If you're excited about this, Okay, so another case study, and this is one that I'll go a little bit more in depth in. And so this is a joint work with Josh Gardner, Rene Kizilcec, and Chris Brooks. And so here we assume, and I think we touched on this a little bit earlier in the discussion, that we cannot share data between institutions, right? So one university can't share all of its data with another university in order to build a predictive model. Universities tend to like keep their data close for privacy reasons and some legal reasons. There are some exceptions to that, right? There are efforts to open this up a little bit, and I think that's great. But for the most part, we're not, we're early on this, right? So let's assume this is the case. And in this case, we're looking at universities, but this extends to schools and other environments where you're trying to transfer as well. And so what we would do, or what we do in this project, in this context, is we develop a common data set. So we've got 4 institutions. Each of us looked at our data. We figured out what can we commonly put into a database that we are sure that you have the kinds of data that I have, and we define things similarly. Okay, so we developed that, and that took quite a while actually to come up with that common data set. And then we built identical models. So we have the same code base, code that checks if all our features are correctly labeled the same way, and then it builds the same models predicting the same target, which is again retention to the second year of undergrad. We use sort of first semester information, just like in the 2 papers ago. And then we transfer between the institutions, right? I share my model parameters with you, you use it on your institution, you give me your model parameters, and so on. And so we did this in these 4 institutions. There's a large public, there's a 2 Hispanic serving institutions, there's an online, there's a private institution in there. So we've got pretty different institutions in terms of their characteristics. Certainly doesn't span the spectrum of US institutions, but there's quite a bit of variation, as you can see, in terms of the different stats here for different groups, okay? And we try 3 different approaches. The first is direct transfer. You give me your coefficients, I run them on my data, and I see what accuracy AOC I get. Voting transfer. So here we ask, what is the effect of taking all the models and doing a soft vote, right? So we have the different institutions, and you basically democratically vote what's sort of most likely to happen to that student. Are they going to drop out or stay in? Right? So that's we call it voting transfer, and then we have stacking transfer, where essentially I'm taking the estimated coefficient from your model and putting it into my data set as I'm training for my own institution. Okay? So we're comparing these 3 versions. And so let me walk you through how we present this. So here, the target institution is A. So I'm A, say, and I'm going to run my A model, source institution, on my own institution. So I get a 0.761 test AUC. And then I take your B coefficient and I run it at my A institution and I get 0.701 and so on and so forth for the different institutions. And what we see there for institution A is that using logistic regression, compared to A, the other models underperform a little, but it's pretty close, right? We would have expected it to work less well, given that they're such different institutions. What we also see is that when we include other models from these other institutions, we can outperform our model alone, right? We see that it's a little better than just our model potentially. And finally, when we include the other models with our own data, we outperform. Wait, it's come up twice. Well, we don't do as well, but when we include the other data, we do better, right? Quite a bit, actually, when we use the information from other institutions, which suggests that if we don't have the capacity to do our own modeling, seems like it may be okay to use another institution's model at our institution, right? And if we do have the capacity, it seems like it's even better if we can use another institution's model parameters to enhance what we're doing at our local institution. Now, I just showed you this for A, but there's B, C, and D. Story is kind of consistent, right? So you always see sort of that the dark gray ones are pretty similar-ish, and in most cases, the voting, the stacked outperform, in all cases, the stacked outperforms everything. So that's what we found. There's one case, actually that's for fairness. So this is the overall performance. And to us, these were all it was surprising how close they all were. We would have expected a lot more variation in performance in these models. But one thing that might happen is that the model from one institution had very few, say, Hispanic students, deployed at an institution that has a lot of Hispanic students, underperforms because it is not very good at predicting for Hispanic students, right? And so that might not show up if the group is small, and so it might be hidden in this overall performance potentially. So we look at fairness.
So what is predictive task?
The outcome, you mean,
Yeah.
is second-year retention. So whether, same as in the first study, whether you enroll, take courses in the second year. And the predictors are all the first semester features. Yeah, please.
So is there a reason why there's an asymmetry? So if you look at A and D.
A and
So target institution A and
Yeah.
on D. Seems like using these data was not useful for target institution A.
Yeah.
If you look at target institution D and you look at institution A, it seems like it helps quite a bit, even more than.
right.
Is there a reason for the asymmetry?
So you could argue that A generally does pretty well. And maybe A has a diverse, large group of students that transfers pretty well to a lot of different contexts. Whereas, see which one was which. B, which is online, the online university. Let's see how B does. That does fine, actually. C is the one that doesn't do so well over here for D, right? But so basically, that's sort of what I would think, and we get to that a little bit for the fairness, where you then might say, well, why don't we strategically get institutions that sort of cover the different bases of students in order to have a model that is likely to cover sort of a large percentage of students. Right? So that's our best guess.
I understood that you just gathered a model trained from the different universities because you cannot share the data. So here I like suddenly thought of the new technology called federated learning.
Yeah.
Like it is just as you know, it's just training and everyone is sharing the weights and sharing the global model. So I wonder if you consider.
Yeah, so Josh actually is working on federated learning, and so you could consider this our first step towards federated learning. So we're extending this right now, the code base, in order to try federated learning. We thought this was sort of a first step towards it. So yes, absolutely, that's something that we're working towards. Yeah.
Mention how to train the model to decide, fix, or comment, etc. I was wondering, for example, some institutions might have certain features that they may have to take to participate in this type of program.
Yeah.
But then they might have enough data points to train their own model that works better because they also have those extra features that they have in other institutions.
Yeah. Right.
I was wondering whether
I
think we're like,
yeah, that's a real concern. So we knew that some of these institutions had, say, summer programs that are in the data that you know that if a student is in that summer program because they may be underprepared in math, and that is a pretty good signal for them struggling a bit more once they get into school, right? But because not everybody has that summer program, we could use those features. And so you have to, at least in this approach, you have to give up on some of those that you know are going to be good. But potentially, right, with some of the easy ways that you can improve the performance, in this case, like adding features from other schools, maybe there's a way of having your cake and eating it, where you can use those features and you can still use information from other institutions in clever ways to enhance the model. Yeah, but it was a very difficult process of figuring out what can we include without making this data set too trivial and not perform good at all, and yet be good. So I'm happy to share what we came up with as of that common data set. We're now putting it to a stress test because we've got the collaborators from Mexico trying to sort of create their data set to fit our common data set. And so we're seeing how that would work across countries, because all these 4 are in the US. All right. So let me just quickly cover bias in this context here, which is we define this measure, which isn't new in the fairness literature, but it's interesting in this context, I think, which is the maximum gap in AUC. So if you have an AUC for each subgroup, how badly are you doing for the worst one compared to the best one that you're predicting? And so it's a very conservative, also very noisy measure. That's one of the downsides. We're looking into updating that for that reason. And we define it in an intersectional way. So we're looking at sex intersected with minority student status. So if your AUC values were to be these 4 for these subgroups, then the AUC gap would be 0.15. Okay, that's how we compute it. And so the smaller the gap, the less bias in the model fitness between the groups. We don't, and intentionally don't, correct for group size. Right, so even if a group is just a few students, we still believe that it matters what the AUC is for those students, right? Just because, I mean, especially if it is a small group, right? We should try and do well for them if they're historically disadvantaged, right? And so we don't do any corrections for that. And so this is what the result for target institution A looked like. So the use of other models, either voting or stacking, reduces the bias in the model, right? So that here you can see 0.31, 0.03. So we're getting better results. And if you want to be also using the most accurate model of the lot, right, then stacking seems like a clear candidate, right? Stacking outperformed all the others, even your local one, and it seems to do quite well in terms of the AUC gap here. So if we look at that across our 4 different target institutions, consistently, right, the model trained an institution has more bias than at least one of the others from another institution. And for most of them, the stacked model has the least bias. There's just one, target institution C, where for some reason it goes up quite a bit.
So the group with the highest AUC and the lowest AUC, are they all the same? I mean,
They don't have to be.
yeah. So I'm just wondering, like, whether the difference decreases, but like maybe some group that had
higher AUC, like.
Went down.
Yeah, or vice versa.
So here's, oops. So here we then to diagnose C and understand what was going on, we did the more complicated version of this, where we show each one and show what the difference is. So in the case of C, what you can see is that it's everybody sort of clustered up there and looks quite good and would have won like the other ones in terms of the size of the gap, except female URM students have a much lower AUC, test AUC here, and that is what increases the gap a lot. However, aside from that, you can see there's a lot of consistency across these, right? Where male URM students are predicted with the highest AUC value across there, and you have a little bit of a sort of movement around here who's sort of worse, but overall it's pretty consistent. Same here, you see that the students are predicted the worst. So within an institution, it seems to be pretty consistent which group is easier to predict and which group is harder to predict. And so I think there's some interesting work to be done to like unpack why, what went wrong here, right? Why is it that it does so badly, even worse than say C? If you use institution C model, you can do quite okay. And then here you're doing pretty badly for that group. Something must have confused the model of the information that came in from the other models. That answer your question? Yeah. So there's, you can expand once, we've also looked at other model types beyond logistic regression, and results change somewhat if you do that. And so you can complicate this along very many dimensions, which is always tricky. There's no standard for fairness of a model in education yet, and we use the gap in AUC, but that's not necessarily the best, and it's certainly very noisy, as you can see from this. We use URM and sex here, but you could just as well use first gen and high income, low income, disciplinary based measures unrelated to demographics. Incoming knowledge. So there's a lot of extensions of this that might make this more complicated, but I think that is important to embrace that complexity and figure out what are the things that matter, what are the sources of variance that matter in the space, and are there models that might be more robust to these sort of outliers and that have some guarantees on fairness. Here's some of these questions, I think, and maybe you have some others that are relevant. Is AUC a metric that we care about in this context, right? Maybe not, right? The whole area is maybe not that relevant. Is the gap really the best measure of bias here? Different subgroups. We only have 4 organizations, right? How does this scale to others? And so we're in the process of recruiting other institutions also around the world to try and join this effort, because it's an easy sell, right? You keep your data, just create this data sets, and we can share the coefficients. How actionable is this model? For instance, did we sort of pick the right model? We think it's a very common task at schools. What about other sources of data, right? We just use the student information system data. You could use LMS data, other model types, and we just measure bias. What if we use techniques to minimize bias, right? What during the training process, which is of course an active area of research. That's something that we want to tap into here too. So if you're interested in this, also let me know. Maybe we can get KAIST data involved too. That'd be great. So I'm going to touch only briefly on explainability and conclude, because most AI systems in education, they're not fully automated, right? There's still a human in the loop that has to operate them, that has to take the insights and act upon them, has to make decisions. And so even if you have the most accurate model, that's perfectly fair, things can still go very wrong if the human does not want to adopt the system, if they don't trust the system, if they misuse it, unintentionally or intentionally. One example of this case is teachers who prefer to be in control and feel in control, and that requires understanding the system, right? So assessments, for instance, even though Neil Heffernan has contributed immensely to work on BKT and improving BKT. His software assessment does not use BKT. And the main reason is because teachers don't understand BKT. And it's more important that the teachers understand it, and they can understand 3 right in a row as a way of demonstrating mastery, than to have the potential accuracy gains that you could get from using BKT. A very similar story from Khan Academy. Right? They used to use more advanced models for determining mastery. Once they were looking at bringing the system into schools, they had to roll back to simpler models that were easy to explain to teachers. And that makes sense, but it raises the question, well, how can you make the more accurate model, especially if you know that there's a sizable difference between the model accuracy, and that can result in actual differences in learning gains and learning efficiency. How can you explain it to teachers in a way that they are accepting of it, that they're okay to adopt it? They don't feel like they're losing control over what's happening in the classroom. And so that's one way of thinking about explainability. That isn't the usual sort of XAI way of thinking about explainability. Another is advising staff who prefer to know why a student is classified as at risk in order to choose an intervention. Right? And so I showed you a bunch of dropout prediction models. None of them told us much about why the student was predicted. Right? If the number of books at home is highly influential, then sending the student some more books is unlikely to solve the problem. So you need explainability in a way that is useful to stakeholders. And so what is required for stakeholders to feel confident to trust the system is, I think, a really important research question in this space. And so XAI research is progressing rapidly. We're seeing a lot of work on explainability just in time. We chatted about that just earlier in behavioral systems. And that's really useful, I'd argue, in cases where expectations are violated, right? You're using a system and then suddenly it does something weird, something you didn't expect, and you're wondering why. And if the system can't in that moment give you a hint, tell you why, make you feel okay about you not understanding why it did that, it can really erode trust in that moment. And that's, I think, where it's especially important for that just-in-time explanation to be available. But beyond that, the first impression of a system, right, what you think it does, why it's there, and for whom it was built, who it serves, I think is critical, because that is what people come into the system with, right? That's the foundation of how they will interpret if something goes not in the way that they think it should go, right? Whether they sort of immediately lose trust, or they're like, oh, I guess that's fine, right? I'm just going to keep using it. And so we did some work a while ago, but it's an area that I think is really interesting. It's around explanations that you can provide, so in framing the system, how it works, that can act as a buffer, so that it's less likely that people lose trust when something unexpected happens. We looked at it in context of peer grading, and we looked also in another study in terms of assessments and sort of interpreting mastery results. But I think it's an interesting area to look at more. And so I think there's an opportunity for research and really broad impact by looking at explainability broadly described, because AI HCI researchers can help with the adoption of these platforms and can help explain this to teachers, right? We have a lot of great systems that are out there, and we need teachers to start using them, instructors to start using them effectively. And I think researchers in AI and HCI have the understanding, are at the intersection of being able to do user studies and understanding the AI and being able to communicate in ways that are non-threatening, that are welcoming, inclusive to stakeholders like teachers, like faculty members, what it is that these tools can provide them with, why it is a good idea for them to use them, how it can make their lives easier, in order to really see the impact that they can have on society and on teacher well-being. So I think that these 3 topics that I talked about today, fairness, transfer, explainability, are all critical topics in AI and education for at least the next 15 years, I think, where we're seeing this explosion in this space. There's a lot to learn. I find from the rapid advances in computer science, I always feel like I'm behind, and some of my colleagues have that same sentiment because conferences like NeurIPS and others are just advancing so rapidly, and it's hard to sort of stay abreast of what the latest advances are. And so I think there's a lot of need for translating and applying, working together with computer scientists in that space. And there might be some epistemological differences. I guess that's my sort of last philosophical aspect, is where something that may seem not like a contribution in computer science is actually a big deal in education. We experienced this with one grant application on transfer, where we had a sample that included most schools in the entire United States using a certain system. But then on a grant, we got feedback from a reviewer that, well, but you only have one sample. But it's like the sample, right? It's close to the population. And so there's sort of, I think, some epistemological differences around sort of what is good work, what is good enough, what you need to do in order for it to be right. And I'm sure that we'll be able to work through those. But it's something to keep in mind, I think, between these fields are coming together and learning from each other. And finally, education is fundamental to society, welfare. But in most parts of the world, it remains very segregated and inequitable. And so being able to address these issues, ensuring that they're fair, facilitating transfer across different environments, making sure that they're explainable and therefore adoptable and trusted, can make a big difference for education technology to have the impact that we all hope that it. So with that, I'm happy to take any other questions. Thank you. If there are questions, I don't know what time. I think we're. Yeah.
In terms of explainability of learning, I think examples of teachers and finding staff members are very understandable. And I'm curious about how you think about in perspective of learners. Learners might use imperfect AI and their errors.
Yeah. I didn't mention them, not because I don't think they're important, but it's just much more complicated, I think. The way you show that data to the different age groups, the different tasks, in a way that encourages, that motivates learners, that they can learn from, it's critical. For them to understand what works, especially to get that immediate feedback, I think the data can be incredibly powerful. And the question is, how do we present it effectively so that learners understand? There's the other part with learners, oftentimes if they're assigned to do their homework on a system like assessments, they don't have a choice, right? They can't go somewhere else, which is good in terms of the data collection aspect, right? So you have consistency there, but it also means that they may not, but you sort of don't have the issue of them sort of leaving the platform, right? And so they have to go through these. And of course, the immediate feedback that they get on correctness and the explanations if they get it incorrect, those are all very important. But in terms of the dashboards that they receive on their progress, I think those are mostly important for motivational aspects, right? Whether you feel motivated that you're progressing, or if you are feeling like you're not motivated, maybe there can be data that helps you feel like you're still doing fine. But I do think that it's a lot more complicated because the social dynamics around it are more complex than in the case of an advisor. His goal is to keep students, mental health good and stay in school and progress towards their school goals. It's sort of a lot clearer than a learner who's sort of interpreting, finding out about how they are doing, maybe in comparison to their peers. So I think it's important and it's a harder problem. Yeah.
I'm MS really interested in learning in AI, their relationships about how students utilize AI in their learning process. And nowadays, when I look up the educational journals and like trying to look up some findings, it is kind of similar to your findings because they are groups they experimented are very different. So they can come up with very diverse conclusions. Like for example, in the language learning, when they use Grammarly to students, some find that they actually learn from Grammarly, but some like think that they don't really learn from. So like I was wondering if in education are there any efforts to integrate such findings?
You mean the difference between the perceived learning and the actual learning, or?
Like because the groups they test,
Yeah.
the systems are really different.
Oh, from the ones we use it.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. I completely agree that the systems need to be tested with the groups that they are likely to be used with, and with a lot of variation. I mean, one of my favorite projects around that was, it was a little bit of a marketing thing, but it also, I think, hit an important point, which is Google's effort to like take this van for user research, and then they drove around the United States and conducted user tests in like tiny little towns in the middle of places that you don't usually do user testing, right? And that so I think made the point in a very marketable way that it's important to get user tests done with not just people who live in Silicon Valley, right, who are not very representative. And I think in the MOOC world we saw a lot of that, right, where the courses were designed by professors who teach sort of a very small segment of the population, very high achieving students. And then when you take that to sort of the world at large, that's a very different population. And so I think the courses have adapted a lot based on those insights. But it was interesting seeing that at first, and seeing just how few students made it through, in part because you can't expect the general public to achieve at a Stanford computer science machine learning level. And that's fine, right? And it sort of was fine to do it that way at first, but I think that's sort of a similar example of where the product wasn't designed for the audience. But also it wasn't clear who the audience was at the time, frankly, right? Like the idea was, let's make these public. Who knew who was going to sign up? No one knew that 100,000 people are going to sign up in a few weeks. So, but yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that's where participatory design can also be a really effective approach, right? Bringing different stakeholders and figuring out together how to make this effective. Speaking also to sort of the questions about how to bring technology into classrooms in a way that teachers are supportive of, right? If you don't ask teachers what is going to help them and how, and figure out what their workflow is and how this is going to fit in, it's more likely than not that the teachers are not going to accept it, or it's not going to fit their workflow. Right? And Neil and Heffernan and his wife Christina both were teachers, right? So they understand, and they talked to a lot of teachers as they were developing a system, just as an example. And that certainly helped with the adoption of that system. So absolutely, it's important to talk to the right groups of participants. Yeah.
I'm a PhD student in this. Through the education, people become a different person, probably become a better person. But along the changes, some are quantifiable and some are not. But if more and more apply AI in the education, I'm afraid that we probably focus more on about the quantifiable aspects, like GPAs or how many classes they can take. I believe that people changes, some changes are not quantifiable. For example, people miss somebody, and some people sometimes find the courage to challenge in other areas more. So I'm curious about your opinion about the applying AI and whether that would change us to more focus on the quantifiable aspects of the education.
Yeah, I agree with your premise that there's a lot that goes on in education that is maybe outside of the classroom, and that helps people grow as a person, and that we don't measure. And I think the whole movement around socio-emotional learning really tried to capture some of this and try to quantify some of this and think about how you could teach those skills. And of course, then you also had a bunch of companies that tried to hire based on this, and it got very commercialized, and now it's somewhat unpopular again, right? And you always have these waves in education. But I think that sort of speaks a little to these things that you learn, like, teamwork, for instance, is a good example. Everyone says we value teamwork. Every company will say they'll hire people who are good at teams because what most things you do are in teams now. There's no class on teamwork in most universities. There are some that do have that, right? We sort of add teamwork into our courses that we teach, and we hope that students learn teamwork as they do it, right? And that has kind of worked so far, right? But you could go ahead and say, well, let's quantify teamwork, and let's sort of design purposefully for developing teamwork skills and see how far you've come from your first year in college to your third year in college. And I don't think that's a bad idea because it would encourage more intentional design of courses for skills that we care about. Right? One of the things that universities don't tend to do is sort of quantify exactly what they want students to come out with, right? Because then you could compare universities in ways that you couldn't before, and then maybe a university that isn't ranked, in the top 10 might do quite well on one of these, and that would be scandalous. So there's sort of some reluctance there to put numbers on certain things and be able to compare them. But 21st century skills, or whatever you want to call them, are critical for addressing 21st century challenges, right? And we need a society that cares about advancing issues that are critical for really life and the planet, right? And that is a post-humanistic society, right? That's something that's not just about our well-being, it's about the well-being of the society. And I'm highly conscious that I'm in a very collectivistic society right now, but not all societies are collectivistic and care more about sort of the collective or even the planet as a whole. So I absolutely agree. Now, is there a danger in measuring these things? There's always a danger in measuring things. Unfortunately, right? Never has there been not that. So it's a question of how it is being used, and hopefully, have people design it, think ahead about how it should not be used, and try and build that into the design of the measures. Yeah.
I was actually an assistant.
Oh.
So
yeah, right. Without the mask. Yeah.
yeah. Actually, I have two questions. If time permits, I really want to ask, but let me start with the first one. I'm actually interested in how to adapt the AI to the workplace. In that setting, I found the example, the dropout prediction. I found it really exciting because I think many instructors or institutions will be interested in adapting that kind of AI for their real world setting. I'm curious why they actually want to adopt that AI for their tasks. Like, basically why they want to predict such dropout. Because I think they probably do something similar, like they're predicting the dropout by just looking at their people's grades or assignments, scores or whatever. So there are plenty of data available nowadays. But even with such data, why do institutions or people still want to adopt that kind of AI, or what? Maybe it can be some reasons might be they want to make more fair decisions, or make more fast decisions. So there can be, I think, type of reasons, but I'm curious whether you observe some actual cases where why people actually adopt that.
And you mean in the work setting or in the education setting?
Whatever, like in the remote setting or in the actual physical university setting.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest reason to give you is that if you have a class in front of you with 200 students, knowing who is struggling and being able to send an email and saying, hey, just checking in. How's the course going? My office hours this time. Let's reach out to a TA is so powerful. Like the emails you get back from those students, right? And then I can do this sort of with a very low AI, I go into the edX rating system and I download the CSV and I click sort by final grade, and I see what the grades are thus far, right? And I select the first 10 students with the lowest grades and I send them an email, right? But the emails you get back from that are so powerful. It's like, oh my God, I'm so glad you wrote. This has happened. You need to tell. Like that is, I think, one of the easiest reasons, right? And well, many instructors don't. I don't know if it's just easy to do for most instructors, but many instructors don't do that, maybe, right? Or they don't think of doing it that way, or they don't realize that the data is available. They could do it that way. And so that's one example of where AI can be helpful in sending those messages and having that communication that we think makes a difference for those students. In work settings, right, the big question is retention. That most companies are worried about retention, right? I mean, the culture in Silicon Valley, so you switch companies all the time, and maybe that's good. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but companies want to retain employees, generally speaking, and if they know who's likely to leave soon, and you can predict that pretty well based on the data that's collected, you could do something about that, like offer them bonus, which might have equity issues, right? Because maybe men leave more often than women or something, and then you have a pay gap or things like that. But there might be cases where you can do things that are unrelated to that. You might also have cases where you're figuring out who to promote, right? And AI can help with that. Who should be a team leader, who has been effective at working with other people. You can see that maybe in how they do code review from the data, and you could sort of use those indicators to help managers make such decisions. So there's a lot of work. If you're interested, you might already know, but Laszlo Bock has an interesting book called Work Rules that summarizes a bunch of work that they've done at Google, which organizational behavior researchers will tell you that they've done all of that like 10 years ago, and it's not new, but he writes about it in a very engaging way. And it's, they did experiments with all Google employees, and so that alone makes it kind of interesting.
So let's see, anyone else has questions? And then you can ask your question personally.
So you showed us data for like predicting the dropout rate for different demographics, like say the gender or like skin color, predicting say dropout rate. So my question is, say some demographics, say some you found that, for example, on the same finding that high income Black females are more likely to drop out. So say this is your finding. So like even in that case, like some high income Black females are not dropping out and some of them are dropping out. So how do you quantify what's the difference that making some of them sticking in and some of them making, like some of them are dropping out? Like what's the difference between the in group?
Why they are dropping out. That gets to the explainability point, right? And understanding what the causes are, right? And so none of the studies I showed really addressed that. But you could try and address that by inspecting the models, what features have a lot of weight, and using various methods that are out there for looking at predictive features in there. And then there's sort of the example I gave, half joking about number of books and sending people books. Some of those features you don't have control over, right? So why would you? So they don't really matter that much in some ways because you can't do anything about them. It might still be useful for you to know that that is an important feature for that group that sort of distinguishes. But some people would argue that you should focus on the ones that are under your control. So that's how you would get at that. And there's a few different methods, like BIF score and some other things to look at. So the influence of different features. There's a few papers now on trying to figure out what should you present to someone. But the thing that I haven't seen yet, and maybe one of you can point me towards it, is sort of study that takes a system that tries to make these predictions and gives it to a stakeholder and really sees how the design choices and how you present the different pieces change the stakeholders' actions, right? And so their attitude, their interpretation, the inferences that they make of the information, right? I think that's a really important area because we don't want people to get confused and not look at it. We don't want them to come out with the wrong conclusions. We want them to make reasonable choices. And that's, I think, a really hard problem. And one where looking within the group might be really helpful because it helps, or maybe you shouldn't look within the group, you should look across. It's unclear.
So like if you want to do some feature work regarding the explainability, so what kind of data you want to like collect, say in that study?
Ideally things that you could change, right? So things about what course load students take in the first semester, for instance. Maybe it happens that students just overwork themselves, right? I can't tell you how many requests I get for students who want to exceed the maximum number of units. It's the maximum of units for a reason, right? Because it's not a good idea to go over the maximum, generally speaking, right? Don't do that for your pressure cooker at home, or so. But it's those kinds of things where you can say, hey, maybe take it easy. It's the first semester. Most students don't do this. Why push too much at the beginning, right? Things that are very much under control of an advisor or of the student themselves, I think are prime candidates for features to focus on.
Thanks.
Yeah, great question.
Okay, so let's,
Awesome.
It's been a long time. So let's end the official part of the talk, and
Perfect.
whoever has questions come up and
Thank you all again.
yeah.